Welcome to Microsoft Virtual Academy. This is XAML for Windows 10, and in this course we'll be talking about
items controls.
Items controls, sometimes referred to as repeaters, those things that show all of your records that you put into your collections. A lot of cool things you can do with them, styling, using them, and there's some complexity to understand as well. Pretty excited about it. Darren, before we get started, tell us just a moment, who is Darren May?
He is me, and I'm the president and co-founder of Crank211, a digital agency that likes to produce next-level digital experiences. And who the heck are you?
I am the president of Crank311, Crank213.
Yeah, the black cat me, didn't you?
Nope, work for Microsoft. I'm a developer evangelist and live in Colorado. Talk a lot about Windows, talk a lot about XAML. In fact, here we are doing it again. You can find me at jerrynixon.com. Okay, so this course is a 2-module course where we'll be, it's sort of a SWAT course where we get in, just kind of hit one topic. And this is where we'll talk about the items control fundamentally, all the pieces so that you can understand what makes it up, as well as then we'll get into all the templates that we'll start employing to make it work. Pretty cool stuff.
Sounds good.
Yep, no doubt about it. If you're a developer of Windows apps, you found the right place. This is where you start honing those skills to become an awesome developer of Windows apps. If XAML and C# are brand new to you, this may not be the place you want to be starting out. That being said, if you're a quick learner, you'll do just fine. Perfect. All right, let's start off with just the fundamentals of the items control, which we know is the base of all the repeaters inside XAML.
Sounds like a plan. So, what is an items control?
Yes.
Well, I think that's it's a good question, a good place to start. And there are a number of different iterations of a items control within the XAML framework, but at its basis, it presents a list of items, kind of self-evident in the title.
Good name.
And you've got a couple of different ways that you can actually approach that. You can create a static list of items, and if you've seen other parts of the course that we've been presenting around XAML for Windows 10, you can see here that we have on the left-hand side an items control, and we have a series of text blocks that are placed within it. So those would be the content for the items control, and in actual fact, they end up going into the items collection.
Got it.
And so if we look over, we can see the visual tree, and we can see how that gets expanded out into a series of containers. We get the text blocks themselves are contained within a stack panel. They're contained within an items presenter. And we can see that all of this rolls up until it's part of the overall control. And on the far right-hand side, we can see here is a present representation of how our list items are shown.
I'm a list item, I'm a list item, I'm a list item.
Yes, indeed.
They have an identity.
They do. So another version of the items control is one that is using data binding. And so instead of setting our items rather, we can bind our item source to a collection. And so in this scenario, what we have here is we have a very simple declaration of our items control with an item source binding to names. We have a list of strings, and they again say, I'm an item. And again, if we look across into our visuals tree here, we can see that there's actually a subtle difference.
Yeah, exactly. Instead of injecting the exact UI item you want, or UI element you want them to show, you're implying it with a string, and so it looks like it's injected its own.
Yes, it's basically determined because this is bound to a string that it's going to display those in a text block. And each text block is placed within a content presenter.
That's different.
And then that is in the stack panel. So that's where the similarity then continues with the previous iteration. But it's very interesting to see that there's those discrete differences in behavior between whether we're data binding or whether we're binding to a fixed list of items.
Sure. Okay, so this property that you introduced first is the items source. That's what we'll be data binding into. And so talk to us a little bit. What can I give it? Obviously I wouldn't give it a string, but I can give it a lot of different types.
Absolutely. So typically you would supply a list of records. Those lists are typically implemented using an interface ilist of T. We can also supply arrays, and one in particular that we'll be using time and time again in data binding is observable collection.
Obviously important for XAML developers because as you move items in and out of that collection, the UI keeps up with you because it has all the eventing inside it.
Exactly. We have that notify collection change, which allows us to update our UI. It's a perfect use for this scenario. We also use the item template property, which we're going to cover in more detail later on. But the key thing about the item template property, the items panel property, or both of them, is that they influence how the data is being presented. Because if we are binding to a complex object that has many, many properties, we're probably not going to want to show all of them. And we're almost certainly not going to want to show the type name when we bind to our list.
No. You're calling .toString, right?
Yes, exactly. So part of this that helps in terms of doing a shortcut to showing how we would display data related to our product is we actually have this display member path attribute as part of our items control. And so in this scenario where we have an item source where we bound to customers, and as we have a look at the code below, we can see that customers is a simple property that exposes out a list of customers. If we look at our customer definition, we can see we have a first name, last name, and display name. So, and if we actually look at the display name,
this property actually reminds me of the combo box, and that was always, display member path.
Yes, and fortunately, there's a reason for that. That combo box actually inherits from items control.
Oh, well, that's logical.
And so we have display member path is available all the way up the stack, which is
I guess display member path, I guess that way I don't have to give it a text block that is also bound to, in this case, display name.
Yep.
I can have it do all that stuff under the scene for me.
Yeah, and it's very nice if you want a fairly simple representation of your information. So it's a good shorthand. And so, as we can see on the right-hand side, it's a pretty simple and straightforward representation of the data. And it just works. It's very nice.
I love the C#6 syntax you have down here to make it so tight code like that. I love it.
Exactly. For those people who aren't familiar with this, effectively is creating an anonymous method that is the getter implementation for the display name. And then this particular syntax here, this dollar represents that we're going to be evaluating this string. We have the string quotations that bound it, and these squiggly brackets. Squiggly. Yeah, we're reusing that. Reference properties that are actually available in scope. So we see first name and last name. So it's actually going to build a string. As you can see on the right-hand side, we can see how that string is represented.
Makes your code so tight.
It does.
Love it. Love it.
So we kind of foreshadowed some of this, but common controls that derive from items control, you can use it directly. It's actually fully featured, as we just demonstrated on the previous
It's not unusual, too. I've used items control many times in my UI because I don't want the extra benefit of scrolling or selecting and all. I just want to repeat some stuff.
Well, you're going to override anyway, and you're going to do your own thing, so why not start lower down the stack and do your own thing?
But sometimes I do want to be able to select an item, and I do want to have keyboard support and things like that.
Exactly, and so that's where list view, grid view, list box, and so on and so forth come into play.
The menu fly out presenter caught me off guard. I'm glad that that is using the items control as its base.
Yeah, it kind of makes sense. It is displaying a list.
That's right.
You're probably not going to interact with it in the same way as many of the lists.
Right.
For example, you're not really selecting an item and expecting to see the item remain selected. You actually almost don't want to have a selection activity, but you want to register click.
And you probably want to put it in a panel, and you want to have it repeat. But yeah, exactly. I see why they did it, and I love it.
Yeah, it's cool.
Wish you could data bind to it.
Can't
data bind.
Can't at this moment in time, that's for sure.
All right, there are some guidelines that we want to think about when it comes to lists as well.
Absolutely. So
why you would pick one of the over the other?
Yes. So your typical controls, list views, they're primarily a vehicle to display text-heavy content. You're going to show lists of names and so on and so forth. They're typically one line. You can make them multi-line. But typically, it's a very succinct way of displaying your lists of data.
Also typically vertical.
Typically vertical, yes, although you can play around with those things. Grid views. So primarily, they're used for image-heavy content. So if you start thinking about the tile presentations that we see in a lot of apps and so on, you're going to be using a grid view for that.
And it's a little bit more rich content that you have. So any media would also show up there and pieces like that. Visually, they're almost the same. The selector looks a little different. That little corner thing that it does.
And in reality, when you think about it, you can, as we're going to see later on in this course, you can change the panels and the layout algorithm within these controls.
That's right.
So you can actually make a list view look virtually identical to a grid view, and vice versa, just by swapping out what the items panel is doing.
Yeah.
So as you say, some of it is really stylistic in terms of the decorators around the selected items.
Yeah. Side by side, you would struggle to see the difference between list view and grid view without just these subtle kind of guidelines. Very good.
So another example for a list is the drop-down lists. Now, the great advantage of these is they take up much less UI surface in their collapsed perspective.
Like choosing your state is a
Exactly.
typical one.
You know, you don't want to list 52 states.
No, you don't?
Especially if you don't.
Well, I'll list them, but I don't want to show them.
Exactly. Hit the drop-down, it pops up, shows what you need whilst you're interacting with it, close down. Sounds good.
52 states?
I waited for that. You heard me say, especially if you don't have any.
You mean Canada and Mexico?
Those are the two. Okay, list boxes.
It's kind of like an open drop-down.
It's an open drop-down, so the key thing here is don't use it for too many.
Okay, yeah, that's right. Yeah, obviously you could scroll inside it, but then you kind of lost the benefit of having it.
Yeah. The key thing that really does over and above the drop-downs is you can use multiple selects. So you can select a few items in there, but again, it's not much point if they're all scrolled off and you can't see you've selected them anyway.
Makes sense to me. All right, so let's talk just for a minute more about lists and the sort of thing that you would display. Obviously, if you have a simple collection and you're wanting to show that, a list will do it. Obviously, a complex list as well if you're going to start grouping things together. And keep going.
Yep. One of the key usage scenarios is in reality the master detail. You'll be using it for the master list of available items that you'll be selecting, and then you'd have a detail pane to the right of that.
Got it. Almost like the Mail app will do that, right?
Exactly. You know, and as we spoke about with grids, fundamentally they're used for things like library collections, anything that's got some rich visual content as well as textual information you want to be presenting. And it also works very well introducing another control that we'll be talking about in a little while, the semantic zoom.
Yeah.
That the problem sometimes with the grid is if you've got a lot of records, then you've got a lot of surface area you need to traverse to move through that collection of items. Sometimes you want to come up a level and see something richer. That gives you that shortcut, much as the same way as you have in the Start menu in Windows 10.
Yeah, just like the Start menu, that's right.
As we mentioned, drop-down lists, they're a great scenario for only using a smaller amount of your real estate for presenting information. And at greater than 5 items, you should be considering whether you should be using radio buttons or check boxes as opposed to just trying to select multiple elements.
Otherwise, it starts to get close to the edge and you're going to scroll inside to scroll.
Yes.
You know, it can be really painful.
Yep, absolutely.
All right, so now selection. This is one of the benefits of the list box base that we get.
Exactly. And so in most situations where you're selecting with things, you're probably going to be with the single mode, where you can select only one item and selecting something else will deselect the item that was previously selected.
Such as a gender drop-down.
Yes.
And the other might be multiple. So now it's going to be, you know, which sides do you want with your meal, right? And you can pick multiple from there, with or without a modifier. Now this is interesting. What do you mean by modifier?
So if you've got multiple selected, then by default it will allow you to just click on a number of different items and they all stay selected. If, however, you select the extended mode, then you can determine what modifier, for example, many of us probably use web browsers where you have to press Shift or Control to select multiple items. You know, Shift generally does a range, Control does individual items, and so on and so forth. So you can implement that behavior pretty easily within your applications as well.
Shift and Control seems so obvious to me, but my goodness, it's so difficult to get my mom to understand.
Yes.
Just use the Control button.
Well, it's the same with so many things, isn't it? You know, what is a common paradigm for us just makes no sense.
Like Alt-Tab, amazingly. It's one of those things that the average user is like, Alt-Tab, you know?
Yeah, why? Why would I be pressing that?
Why don't I just restart every app every time I need it? You know?
Exactly.
That's beautiful.
Anyway, yeah, we're superior. They're not.
Well, that's what we're trying to get
That's
at.
really what we're saying, isn't it? Yes.
I think we, as a
the collective, yes,
understand.
We understand this
our
stuff.
superiority is implied.
Absolutely.
Yes. All right. So those are basically the controls we'll use it with. Now we want to start feeding the data into it.
Exactly. And so we've kind of touched on before data binding in many different ways, but there is a particular sort of intermediary. I used this when we were talking about this earlier, this idea of an intermediary that helps manage some of the more complex binding scenarios that may exist.
Oh, okay. So I have a collection of all my data. You have the list box, and we're going to put something in between that does some sort of magic?
Yes. And sometimes the middleman gets in the way and makes life a little bit more complicated. And to be honest, there is some complexity associated with the collection view source, especially using it in some of its more advanced scenarios. But it does provide some great capabilities. One is grouping. It allows us to perform some manipulation of our data, collect them into groups, and have this presented in a very pleasing way within our listing controls.
So grouping data is automatically supported inside these objects, these items control objects, but it won't work unless you're using the collection view source.
Exactly. And they have to be formatted in a specific way, and we'll show you an example of that later on.
Okay.
The other great thing about this is the collection view source can be leveraged by multiple list controls, or other controls in actual fact. And what this does is it acts as a broker that makes sure that all of these different controls are using the same selected item.
Ah, yeah.
And so it acts as a almost
kind of a current selection.
Exactly.
I see. Well, that's nice. I can see the value of that. That's very, very cool. And it keeps all of your UI in sync as well if they're all binding to that selected item.
Absolutely.
Okay.
So what we're going to sort of walk through now is how we would approach building out the data structures that we would leverage inside the collection view.
Okay.
So what we have here is we're just talking about building the item model. And so this is a pretty simple class. I happen to have extended it with implementations of iComparable and iEquatable. And that's for really manipulating the data list and making sure that I don't have duplicate entries, because I have a generate customers method in here. And so it's a big data generator that
must not duplicate.
For some reason, you have to do things alphabetically. I just can't duplicate data.
Okay. But to be clear, iComparable and iEquatable, you see them all the time, but they're not required for
They're
items.
absolutely not required. Some would say that if you're building these types of data classes, that you probably should be implementing iComparable and iEquatable, because it's quite likely that at some point in time, you're going to be comparing customer instances. And you might want to turn around and say, is this the same customer?
Yeah.
And you could use ID, but in this class, there is no ID. So we probably want to come up with some other way of uniquely identifying this, and probably display name is that basis.
Oh, I see the $ here. That's the same. This is the same class we saw a slide or two before.
It is. It's almost as if it was foreshadowed.
Okay.
Okay. So now...
new class.
Absolutely. And so you don't have to create one of these classes if you're going to be grouping data, but I personally find it much easier to have a concrete representation of what my group is going to look like.
So do I.
And so I like to create this customer group class. So what we have here is, this represents, as you can see, the idea is that last name is the key by which we're going to group our data. And then the list of customers contained within this customer group class is all of those customers that share the last name.
That's nice. Okay, that's pretty logical. If you didn't do this, you would always have to, I don't know, debug to figure out exactly what you're grouping things by.
Exactly.
That's
and
tricky.
So I like it to be very declarative like this, and it makes it much easier to debug and certainly to explain to other people. And then we have a very simple property that exposes up our customer groups.
Ah, yeah. Okay.
So then let's talk about building the group data. So we have some very powerful tools available to us in C#, and that's the link toolset that allows us to do a lot of very fancy things. Now, what we have at the top here is we have customers is equal to customer.generate customers 200. This is my little data generator routine.
Oh, sure.
That's a static factory method on customer that's just going to return me 200 random customers.
Okay.
Okay, so there's magic going on there. Don't worry about it too much. We then have order by. So what we're doing here is we're starting to sort our list first by the last name and then by
I like that.
our first name.
Yep.
So again, it's very easy to read and understand what's going on. We're then projecting that into a list format. And so customers is being assigned to a list of T customer containing our sorted data set.
Yep, I understand. I like that.
The next thing we're doing is we're going to work into grouping. So I've switched from the dot syntax for link to more of the native language query, because this is actually very easy to read in this form.
Yeah, almost feels like SQL Server.
It does, it does. So we're going to create our grouped object. So for each customer, essentially in customers, we're going to group customer by the customer last name, and that's going to get projected into the group object.
Yes.
We're then going to order that group object by key, which is the last name. So that makes sense again why we would do that.
Yes.
We're now going to take that group object and select it into a new customer group where we're assigning group.key to last name, and we're assigning our customer's value to the group to list.
So that's the actual list of all the customers. I see.
That match that last name.
Okay.
And so then what we do is we take the grouped item, project it in a toList of customer group, and that's what we assign to our customer groups property.
Which is really, and simply, just a list of customer group classes, which has two properties, a single string and a list.
Yes.
Yeah, so there's nothing really too sophisticatedly magic about it.
No.
But it's what you need to do if you're going to group data.
It's what you need to do if you're going to group data. And having a concrete example like this, I think, helps crystallize what we're doing.
Okay. Perfect.
So then we want to declare our collection view source.
Mm-hmm.
So
you could do this in code, but it is so much more obvious when you're doing it in XAML.
It absolutely is. And of course, it makes it much easier to share if we declare it in XAML, because it's a resource that we can access. So here's our collection view source. We called it CVS customers for collection view source customers. We've set its source to binding to the customer groups property.
All right, got it. Somewhere in your view model, or in this case, it looks like the code behind. Got it.
Absolutely. We've specified is the source grouped equals true.
Ah, that's the trigger.
So that's the trigger that sets things up. And we've also got a handy reference to the items path, which says how do we get to the items inside here. And if you recall on the previous slide, we have the customer's object, which is containing our customers.
That is the path into it.
And that's our path into the items within our selected object in the custom view source.
Now, items path is optional if it happens to be that your customer class inherits from collection. It knows how to handle it from there.
Exactly.
It'll use an indexer.
Yep.
Okay.
Now we have our collection view source. We want to work out how we're actually going to consume that.
Okay.
And so here's the key thing. We're now starting to work with two controls that are going to be interacting with, or two groups of controls, I should say. Mm-hmm. The first is going to be our list view. And so we're going to leverage this as our master data list.
Got it.
And so
this is the only repeater in this scenario.
In this scenario, yes. And so now our list view is being bound to CVS customers. Now, what's very interesting about this is we're using XBind.
Ah, yes.
And so in XBind, we're specifying that we need to go to the view object of CVS customers. And that represents the current view of our customer's source. So this is a read-only perspective, but it also includes what the current selected item is, so that it will track across multiple controls. We have an item template here, which we're going to cover in a little bit more detail later, but that's going to show how the data is being represented in this list view.
Okay.
We also have a list view group style. Now, this is a pretty cool capability that allows us to determine what the group style header is going to be for our data. We've already, the whole reason for using this collection view source in this scenario is we want to show group data. So this allows us to specify how that group data header is presented in our list view.
Got it. Got it. A lot of developers maybe haven't seen group style. That's because they're not grouping their
exactly.
data.
Exactly. So a lot of new things perhaps coming across people's...
Yeah, so then we go down to details. And so now this is not a repeater. We're just wanting to show one record. And of course, we don't forget that the collection view source handles the selected item, tells us which one is currently selected. And this is trying to show that selected item.
Exactly. And so what we've got here is we're using classic binding to show that you can really mix and match these things.
Not because it's necessary.
It's not necessary, but it certainly is easier.
Okay.
What we're doing here is we're going to our static resource CVS customers. And what's interesting to see is we're not having to worry about specifying view. So there's some specific behavior that's built into the classic binding that understands how to deal with a collection view source. So then in this scenario, all we need to do is specify path equals first name. And it knows, because this is not an items control, that we are instead referring to the current selected item in the collection view source. And so this is now binding to the first name and last name of the currently selected customer.
Yeah, that's very logical.
So this is where we spoke about earlier on how binding is probably the most flexible and most powerful of the binding expressions that are available to us.
Yeah.
Therein lies its weakness, and because it can do so much, it's not necessarily optimized for any of them.
Okay.
Whereas, as we mentioned in template binding is optimized for a one-way binding within the scope of the templated control. And XBind is optimized as long as you have the means to strongly type your binding expressions.
Very good.
So this is an example of how this would render up.
This is sort of like a cooking show. Now we just pulled it out of the oven.
Yeah, here's one I prepared earlier.
Uh-huh.
And as we can see, Anthony Brown is ready and is at 350 degrees. So to really stretch the analogy. So on the left-hand side, here we have our list. And what we can see is we have a group header here, which shows the last name. So that's bound to our collection view source, and that's the group style header. We have our list of elements, and these are all the customers that share the last name of Brown. We have Brown Anthony selected, and we can see in our detail view on the right-hand side that Anthony Brown is in fact selected.
Very nice. This is a classic implementation of master detail.
It is.
Nice. All right, so one of the things we were talking about was the semantic zoom. This is our ability to look at data in one, let's say, view, and then to switch to a different view. And conceptually, we try and make that a more a distant view, right? So you're kind of looking at your data from a higher level.
So if we come back and quickly look at this, we can see this scroll bar here. We can see how long this scroll bar is. And that obviously tells us there's a lot of data. So if we want to get to somebody who had a last name of Zachary, then we've got to scroll a long way to get to that data. Wouldn't it be great if we had a shortcut to be able to jump to the Zachary last name group? And so that is what, in a nutshell, the semantic zoom can provide us if that's how we develop it.
And in this case, you've implemented it, and we'll see more in the sample and when we start seeing it, where you tap on the name, and it's just the same experience you get all through Windows now. Exactly,
and that's a key point. In the previous iterations of Windows, there was a slightly different experience between the mobile experience and the desktop experience. That's now being consolidated into a single experience where tapping on the header will bring you into the zoomed out view.
Instead of pinching.
Instead of pinching on certain devices.
Got it.
Okay.
So this is what it looks like to implement semantic zoom.
And it's got simpler, to be honest, than it used to be. We have a simple semantic zoom control. Inside there, we have two views that we can define. And we effectively, you can imagine the zoomed in view is a container. And we drop into there the view that we want to use. So the zoomed in view is our list view. So this is identical to what we were using earlier on in our master detail. Now just drop that into the zoomed in view. And then we need to create a higher level view. And again, we've switched to XBind here to show the dot properties that we need to navigate to get to the collection views. So it's kind of interesting to do that. So we can see that our CVS customers .view has a collection groups object. That is what we're actually accessing to be able to get into here. We're binding that using an item template to show what we're going to display, and we'll cover that in a moment as we jump into the templates.
Okay, got it. So zoomed in is a list of every name, and then the zoomed out is a list of every last name.
Exactly.
So I can navigate through that. That's beautiful. Should we look at it?
I guess we should.
Slides are nice.
Slides are nice.
These are great slides. I mean, we're not talking bad about the slides here.
So let's, first and foremost, let's run up the application.
All right.
So here we have an application that looks stunningly similar to the one that was prepared earlier.
Is this a slide? Because it looks just like a slide.
It scrolls. It could be
an animated slide.
It could be a GIF on a slide, but it's not. So if I switch around, you can see how the detail view updates.
Last name doesn't seem to update.
That's because we're in the same group. If I click on the last name header, now we zoom into our zoomed out view, I guess. We zoom into our zoom out. That doesn't really work. If I click on Williams, I jump to the Williams group. But again, I can move between all of these groups, and it's a really nice behavior where if I start to scroll Smith up, you can see it swaps in and stays there.
Sticky headers? Is that
yeah, sticky headers.
Love it.
So this is nice, and this would actually
it really is nice.
yeah. Indulge us. We're going to play with this for about 2 hours.
Right.
This would actually be really difficult to build yourself.
Yes, it would.
Those types of behaviors.
Let's not overstate it. We could do it.
We could.
Yeah, for sure.
We absolutely could.
There is no doubt about it. We could rebuild the entire platform given enough time and money.
Yeah, and enough monkeys on keyboards.
They're writing War and Peace.
Exactly. Exactly. So that's what it looks like. Let's have a look at the practical aspects of bringing this in. So we kind of covered this in the static slides, but I think it's useful to look at the code. So first and foremost, let's return to our data So what we have here, here's our expressions that generate our bound data for our customers. Here's our group. And so there is no additional magic going on in here. This is the generate customers class. It's very long because of the test data. These, as I mentioned before, are just the equality checkers, and they're not difficult to implement.
No.
You know, it's worthwhile doing it on rich model classes that you're building. And here's our customer group. So there is no additional magic other than what we went through on the slides.
Yeah, nice. To be so beautiful, it has very little code.
Absolutely. So if we actually look at our data or our code itself, here's our semantic zoom. We've got our list. Inside our list view, we have our data elements. We have our zoomed in group header template. So let's have a quick look and see exactly how that's defined.
Right. So this is the way the header looks.
Yep.
Now I remember in the demo you just gave, it was basically just a text.
Exactly. And that's exactly what we have. We have a text block that is bound to show the last name.
I see.
Because we're using xbind inside a data template, we have to use the x data type so that the data template knows the strongly typed object that we're using so that it can generate the code efficiently. If we don't have that, it can't generate code. Xbind's not going to work. So that's our zoomed in template. Oh, sorry, that was our zoomed in group header template. We also have an item template, which determines how items are presented within our list. Again, that's pretty simple and straightforward. It's a text block, display name, one way. Very, very simple, very easy to use.
Glad it's in a grid.
Exactly. Our zoomed out view is again a list view. Here's our expression that gets into the collection groups, and we're using the zoomed out template. If we jump up to here, here's our zoomed out template. And again, very, very simple, but more complex than you might have expected.
Group dot.
We have to use a data type iCollectionViewGroup, which is given to us by the framework.
Okay.
And we are using this very interesting syntax, which allows us to strongly type a sub-property. So what we're doing is group dot is getting us to an instance of local customer group dot last name. So this is how we can almost cast. Isn't it an interesting syntax?
Group dot open parenthesis.
Uh-huh.
And what does it do again?
This is pretty much casting this to a strongly typed group name of last name. Isn't that an interesting syntax?
That is fascinating.
Yeah, now you wish you'd opened this up when you were reviewing the slides, didn't you?
Yeah.
Okay, so.
With all those typos, I had no time. Well, that, you know what, that tricky syntax right there is worth entire admission right now.
Exactly.
Yeah. Wow. And the iCollection.
This was one of the hardest things actually to get the collection view source, and I was determined to get it working with xbind because I saw no reason why it shouldn't, because we know all the types. But I had to really dig down to find the documentation that would actually show this expression.
So I still have the monkeys jumping on the keyboard. We haven't gotten to it yet. It's like, remember in The Simpsons, when they had all the monkeys on the, it's like, it was the best of times, it was the worst of Tims, you monkey!
Yeah. That's what it's like when it's reviewing our slides. Yeah, every time we start to present, we also find the very first slide, there's a typo.
Every time. It's so funny.
It's crazy.
It's funny.
Anyway, don't mind us.
Our names are never misspelled.
No,
there's certain things that have priority.
Yeah, Jerry May.
All right, so let's move on to can we move on?
What I was going to touch on was the style selector. So it's something that was actually, I stumbled across really as I was working through these, looking at the different properties that were available to us. And I came across the item container style selector. And I thought to myself, I haven't used this.
Neither had I, yeah. Certainly the template selector.
Yeah.
But I've never done the style selector.
So in order to explore it, one usually starts hacking around with code.
Calls in the monkeys.
Exactly. Bring on the monkeys. So let's bring this one in, and I'm going to include the declaration for this. I actually need all of these. So what we have going on here is some declarative XAML that creates a style. So I've got an item style. This is going to match our regular item. I have an alternate item style that again is tied against list view item. That makes it bold but gives it a background of light blue. Then I have this new thing called alternating style selector. It is an entrance into my resources, so I have access to it.
That's just a namespace.
This is the namespace, yes. This is nothing to do with collection view source. This is the namespace of my demo.
Ah, gotcha.
Okay, but alternating style selector is a custom object that I've created. We've got two properties here that are being set, alternate item style and item style. So let's have a quick look at this alternating style selector, because again, this was a bit of a journey of discovery. So, alternating style selector. You extend style selector as a base class, which is part of the framework.
Okay.
These are two additional properties I created to allow me to supply item style and alternate item style.
Just like a data template selector, you don't have to make those dependency properties to work, which is nice.
It is nice. I've overridden select style core. Now, this is passed in the item that we're actually showing and the container for the item. What I'm doing here is obviously, as the name suggests, I want to create an alternate style for each item in the list view. And in order to do so was not as easy as I originally thought. Because
how do you get the index of the current item without having reference to the container?
that is the problem. Or
not.
We get the reference to the list view container.
Yeah, that list.
But we don't get a reference to our parent container.
Yeah.
So, funnily enough, I'm guessing other people must have encountered this problem because we have a magic method that has appeared on items control that solves this. So we take our container and we cast it as a list view item.
Okay.
That's pretty simple and straightforward. We then have the items control class. So this is not an instance of items control. This is nothing to do with any of the lists we may have. In fact, you may recall that we're actually using a list view, which is derived from items control. So we're accessing an items control static method that gets the items control from an item container. So we then pass in our container and we cast that to a list view because we know that's what it is.
Okay.
We now have a list view. So if our list view is not equal to null,
let's hope it's not.
Indeed.
It'd be weird to be.
Then we do list view dot index from container, and we then pass in our container, and we use modulo 2 to work out whether it's an even or odd.
Yep.
And so if it's even, we return item style. If it's odd, we return alternate item style.
Well, my goodness, look at that weird code.
Yep.
Who would have guessed that those two methods, let alone this base class, were sitting there looking at us the whole time?
Indeed. So let's run and assume it works.
I remember in WPF it was the alternation index. Do you remember that?
Yep.
Alternation.
And so here we see the change in this class. So we still have all the selections, but now we have this alternating property. We can still jump back. We still have all of our behaviors and so on. And it actually makes it a lot easier to read. Yeah. Probably not this way, but
right.
Somebody with a designer's eye would make this much more palatable.
Neat. How do you do alternating colors in a list view? Now we know.
We can certainly do it this way, and we'll actually be looking at other ways we could do it later on.
Oh, okay, brilliant. That's exciting. Whoa, man.
Woohoo.
Make it more like a mystery.
Absolutely. So let's switch back to the slides.
So that was the item container style being set by the items container style selector.
Yes, indeed.
Okay.
And so let's quickly recap that. I felt like, as we were already in there, it didn't make much sense to jump in and jump out.
Yeah, no, and that was cool.
So, item container style allows us to really override the style for each item. We can introduce a lot of nice properties around this. You already had a module where you discussed heavily styles and the capabilities of these things. And so with this particular one is targeting a list view item. And we're adding borders and padding around these things and so on and so forth so that it allows us to separate out our data and present it in a more interesting way.
Nice.
This is the style selector that we talked about. And as we can see, the code is pretty straightforward once you know of these methods. Finding these methods is sometimes the challenge.
Yeah, those very good. Boy, everybody take a screenshot. And
it's gone.
Okay, nice work. We won't repeat that demo because it was good the first time.
Sure. Well,
that was pretty educational. We were able to look at the fundamental parts of a items control, with items control as the base of pretty much every repeater inside XAML, and all of the different templates that you'll be applying in that. And we'll cover that in really great detail in the next module. But we got to kind of tinker with some of the styling, as well as to see what the role of a collection view source was so that we can group our data and see it in a special way, using the semantic zoom so that we can see really something, kind of a signature experience to Windows, to be honest.
Yep.
So you can step back from your data and navigate a large list very easily and quickly. And then we get to see the item container style. How cool was that?
Sounds good.
All right. We'll see you again at the next module in this course on advanced templates.